All right, let's now welcome Mr. William Bird, who's the Director of Media Monitoring Africa, to weigh in on this discussion. William, great to have you with us on the show this afternoon. Now, you were recently part of a gathering on finding some ways, right, to regulate the social media space, especially pertaining to news and how podcasters aren't, in fact, some podcasters, in fact, let me say that, aren't well-researched journalists, and that theirs is mostly a personal opinion. And the conundrum there was then, how does the public actually receive or interpret some of what they said? Let's look at the incident in question, right? It speaks to exactly this, but what type of action can be taken against the podcaster in your view?
The first thing is that the minister was correct to say that we need to condemn racism. Bitterly ironic that he himself then is guilty of Afrophobia. Be that as it may, there are a number of things that can be done. The first is that he said that this was being carried on MultiChoice's platform. Now, because of that, they can actually lodge a complaint with the Broadcast Complaints Commission, because it was broadcast on a MultiChoice platform, and I would strongly advise them to go ahead and do that as their first port of call. The second thing is that if they believe that the words constitute hate speech, then what they should be doing is taking it and reporting it to the South African Human Rights Commission. They're the body tasked with determining and addressing hate speech, because there they can open a case with the Equality Court. So while podcasts that are not connected to any broadcaster, for example, on the MultiChoice channel, or if they are an SABC podcast that is broadcast by SABC, then it would fall under the BCCSA. While some of those that then aren't linked to any of those seem to not have any kind of self-regulatory structure, the South African Human Rights Commission is empowered to go after and to make sure that those people can be held accountable.
Absolutely. I mean, William, talk to us about what is your observation also on the current uptick of podcasters and podcasts in South Africa. We're just talking about journalistic ethics in relation to the attempted bribery story earlier on, William, and we concluded that it's quite easier for media houses, as you've also just rightfully pointed out, and employers of journalists to hold their employees to account. But in this matter, I mean, the Sports and Culture Minister took a swipe without giving alternative reforms also of how this space can actually be monitored or even regulated. Every day there are new podcasts mushrooming, hosted by people we don't know, with different views and opinions, talking about a wide range of current affairs as well as other issues of concern, William. So how do we then strive and strike that balance in terms of the responsibility, one, by the podcasters as well as those platforms that actually give them the platform to give out their opinion, so to say?
So really it comes down to matters of remedy, right? Which is, so any podcaster now, if they wish to, they can join the Press Council of South Africa, and then they will fall under their code. And what that means is that if someone has a complaint, they don't need to go to the courts, they don't need to go to the Equality Court, for example, or to the Human Rights Commission. They can just go to the Press Council and have the issue addressed there. Where you're dealing with a very serious issue like hate speech, for example, then it is important to make sure that you get that addressed by the South African Human Rights Commission, because hate speech is a human rights violation, and determining it is quite a tricky thing to do. So either you can belong to the Press Council, in which case you've got a form of recourse. If you don't, in other words, if you're just a podcaster that's broadcasting, and streaming your podcast on any number of platforms, and someone has a complaint like that against you, they can report you to the South African Human Rights Commission. And when you're there, the South African Human Rights Commission can then call you in, even if you're not based in South Africa. The challenge, of course, comes in that there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of podcasts all over the world. And what you need to then do is find a mechanism that says, here's how we're going to determine whether or not the South African Human Rights Commission effectively has some level of jurisdiction over that particular entity. And the general principle that appears to be being developed internationally is, if you can demonstrate that a podcast or that content or that platform is causing harm to people in South Africa, then the South African Human Rights Commission can probably go and hold them to account. But that's only on very serious issues. On all of the other issues of accuracy, or even something quite serious like defamation, If they don't belong to one of those entities and if they're outside of our jurisdiction, then you're going to really struggle to hold them accountable, unfortunately, which does show that there is a very real gap that needs to be addressed in terms of saying, how do we deal with some of these other online harms? We know, for example, platforms like X are not accountable. They operate and they have, with utter disregard to our constitution and to dealing with the kinds of very serious issues that we raise there.
And William, maybe just talk to us. Remember, I made reference to in the beginning of our interview that, of course, that gathering that you were part of, where you were talking about some possibilities in terms of regulating this space. So currently, do you know, or what can you tell us about podcasters being bound or not being bound by any ethical or legal broadcast code or framework before they actually sign to actually operate within the space? Or they just decide, look, if I've got a mic in a studio, I can just go into my house and start podcasting?
I mean, that's the benefit and the downside of having high levels of freedom of expression, which we're delighted to say that we do have, which is to say that anyone can, and indeed I think that they should be able to go and just start up a podcast. And if they can get people interested in it, good for them. I think the challenge comes when you say, well, if you're going on and making a podcast and you are claiming to be a journalist, and yet you just make things up, or you spread disinformation, or you use that podcast to cause harm, then there becomes a very real problem. So many instances, those people aren't bound by any kind of ethical code. Of course, what we're moving towards is to say we do need to rely and make sure that we rely on media and on influence people and content creators who we know are credible and are trustworthy. And it's about making sure that we can identify who they are. So SABC, for example, is one. If you're watching a podcast and it's an actual SABC podcast, then you can know that if there's something that's problematic in that, then you've got a form of redress. Where you're listening to a podcast and they're saying things that you find offensive or whatever problem you kind of have with that, unless they belong to one of those bodies, unless it's a very serious rights issue like hate speech, unfortunately, in many instances, you're unlikely to get any form of redress from them, depending on how they respond to your issue, of course.
Very concerning indeed. And I was just about to ask you, Willem, unfortunately, we're out of time, in terms of how then these podcasters could even learn from legacy media frameworks like the SABC. But we're going to leave it there, William. Thank you so much, as always, for insightful input there. That is Mr. William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa on podcasts and the regulation.